in this last panel, we will be talking about European defense and a sovereign European defense. But before I give the floor to the last panelist of the day, I also want to give the chance to make a brief introduction on the current situation with the European defense. So, as you may be aware, Europe's security environment has shifted dramatically. With the Russians' invasion of Ukraine and also the return of major power competition and the rising global instability, the European Union has had to confront fundamental questions about its security. And also these events have exposed that Europe's fragmented defense landscape and its reliance on NATO for deterrence. As you may know, Europe's difficulty building common defense is not a new thing. It goes back to the 1950s when the European communities were being instated, and with the first failed attempt, the European Defence Community, and with repeated struggles after the years. And the issues towards arrive in a defense union basically lies on national sovereignty. So defense is perhaps the clearest expression of statehood, and of course giving authority over it to Brussels is politically sensitive and it's unpopular. And also many fear that too much EU integration in this topic could duplicate NATO structures and weaken transatlantic ties. So the war in Ukraine exposed these structural weaknesses, and Europe discovered that it lacked sufficient industrial capacity to support military equipment at the scale that the modern warfare requires, and as I think Professor Beltz pointed out earlier already. And despite political commitments to strengthen the European defense industry, most recent equipment purchases, I think it's 4 out of 5, come from outside of the European Union, and mostly they come from the United States. So in response to all of this, the European Union launched last March the Readiness 2030 plan, which aims to strengthen Europe's preparedness and also focus on strengthening the industrial base, the defense industrial base of the European Union, and setting the first setting stone for a European Defence Union. This entails also what you may have heard, the SAFE initiative, which is an initiative that is made of 150 billion euros that are destined in loans for member states in order to procure on key defense capabilities. But also another symptom that we can see how security has become relevant in the EU scenario is, for example, the proposal that the Commission put forward last July for the next multi-annual financial framework, in which security became one of the 2 main priorities for the next plan, the next budget, and also defense spending would be multiplied by 5 in comparison to the current budget. So all of this raises deeper political questions that Europe must confront. So how much sovereignty are member states truly willing to share, and how can the EU strengthen its industrial base without undermining NATO cohesion? And perhaps the most fundamental question is, what does a sovereign European defense actually mean in practice? Does it mean full autonomy or a stronger European pillar in the NATO framework? So to help us navigate these issues, we have here today with us Dr. James Corum. Dr. Corum is a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel. He's also a military historian and specialist in air power and counterinsurgency. He spent many years teaching for the U.S. Army before becoming Dean of the Baltic Defence College, and I think his perspective will help us explore what a credible path towards a sovereign European defence might look like. So please, Dr. James Corum, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a tough act to follow. 2 really interesting and enjoyable presentations where I learned a lot. My presentation is going to be much more on the military side of the strategy and the more practical things. I've only been to the NATO political headquarters once, and that was really a tour. I have been many times to the NATO military headquarters in Mons, doing business there. So I understand the strategic military side of NATO, and that might be a useful aspect for this talk. So I'm going to talk about the strategic threats that we Americans and Europeans face, and my assumption is that whatever politicians say is that American and European security are fundamentally linked. I am fiercely nationalistically American. At the same time, as a fiercely nationalistic American, I believe that American security is European security as well, that our fundamental values and interests are the same, and if European security is in trouble, American security is. So I am a great advocate for the Europeans. And when we talk about threats, we need to talk about some realistic solutions. And we'll start by understanding how we made some very bad strategic decisions over the last 30 years. I'm interested in explaining how we make bad decisions and how it happens. And I believe it's important to talk about how to fix the failures and the problems in our strategic decision making, and what are the issues that keep us from making good decisions, and a few practical suggestions. My personal perspective, European security is my family business. My grandfather was a professional Army officer for 40 years. After World War II, he was the commandant of a German state. Did pretty well at the job. My father was a professional U.S. Army officer. Came to Europe during the airlift time. He was an intelligence officer in Berlin in the early days. He didn't tell me about the things he did until I was already an officer with a top secret clearance, and then he told me about his career in Berlin, kidnapping Russian agents and things. My mother was a U.S. Army civilian brought to Germany to take part in the occupation. And that's how my parents met. And that's why I am here today, as a product of the U.S. Army occupation of Germany. Of course, my father was stationed again later in Germany in his career. My brother was 6 years in the Army. He was a captain up on the border of East Germany, running an intelligence detachment. My uncle, career military, West Point colonel, younger officer, he was stationed in France. By the way, my father was stationed in France too. I was born in France. Je suis né dans le 6e arrondissement à Paris. And not only was I born in France, but I studied at Heidelberg as a German. I also studied at Oxford, so I got a European education. My first tour in the U.S. Army was in a Pershing missile unit, nuclear weapons, in Germany. And afterwards, I went to study at Oxford. I was attached for 3 years to the British Army. I did training with a British Reserve unit. I belonged to a British regiment. In my time as an Army Reserve officer, I was in units that were directly committed to the defense of Europe. In fact, every year, I was in a logistics unit. 1,100 NATO logistics officers would meet every summer for 2-week exercises in Camp Shelby, Gettysburg, Mississippi. And we learned all about large-scale logistics, Europeans and Americans all together by the hundreds. And this is not the privates, and these were the staffs that learned to do that scale. Remember, I'm old enough to remember that when the Bundeswehr had 12 first-rate divisions and outstanding equipment and outstanding training, that was long before most of you were even born. And then I was the dean of the Baltic Defence College. I worked for 3 Baltic countries' defense ministries. I don't know if anyone else here has worked simultaneously for 3 defense ministries. Actually, it was a pleasure. I love the Baltics. But what's most important, in 2003, 2004, I was a strategic planner. Also 2002. I was involved as a faculty member of the Army War College, teaching the reserve course. I was called up. I took part in we actually wrote a plan for the occupation of Iraq in 2002. It was a small team of people did this. It was actually a pretty good plan. It was published, called Reconstructing Iraq, but the top decision makers decided that we didn't need a plan, and they threw it out. They didn't like what the plan said. They said, well, yes, we can sort of occupy Iraq and make it a success, but it will take years, it will take a lot of troops and cost us a lot of money. And the people in charge didn't like to hear that. So they decided not to have a plan. And we know how that turned out. I was later sent to Iraq in a small team to be a strategic planner to actually create a new Iraqi armed forces. I and one colonel actually wrote a complete strategic long-term plan to create an Iraqi Air Force. That didn't work out very well either. 2005, 2006, I was one of a small team that wrote counterinsurgency doctrine for the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. This is one of the 6 doctrine manuals from which all doctrine flows. It's like the Gospels to the epistles and so on. So my view is I'm going to talk about a lot of what I saw from the inside and how, having watched strategic disasters as an insider and giving you some insights, so hopefully we can someday avoid the same things. There are 2 great problems that inhibit rational strategic policies. Now, I wrote a book about one of them called Bad Strategies: How Major Powers Fail in Counterinsurgency. I took 4 case studies. I took France and Algeria, Britain and Cyprus, America, Vietnam, and Iraq. And I started out looking at how they made bad decisions. And it was amazing how Britain and France and America, being great democracies, I didn't study how dictatorships do this, how decision-making works in democratic nations. And it turns out that the failures in thinking and planning were incredibly similar between the British, French, and the Americans. And the issue was, in every case, is that you had a strategic problem and you had ideologues committed to one viewpoint take over the process, and in doing so excluded any debate, any other ideas, and refused to modify their initial bad assumptions. And that was the key problem in Vietnam. It was the problem in Iraq that I saw. But when I went through the original documents, I found that the British at times did exactly the same thing, and the French did exactly the same thing. The decision-making process of the military and with their political leaders. So I wrote a book about that. Now, the second thing that inhibits good strategies and planning, and I wrote a book about that too, called Fighting the War on Terror. By the way, both of these, especially bad strategy, you could get for €4 on the e-version. So for the price of a good drink, you can get one of my books, and it's worth it. But Fighting the War on Terror, and I just been involved in all of the defense planning as a planner. I basically talked about how the bureaucracy failed. You see, every time you go into a conflict, assume that you are not organized to fight that conflict correctly. You have to look at your organization and see what you need to change and amend. Well, they didn't do that. In fact, the bureaucratic approach to the fighting the war on terror in Iraq and so forth was destined to fail. And it was purely a result, to the greatest degree, a result of the answer being adding extra layers of bureaucracy. We actually so bureaucratized our decision-making process is that we guaranteed a failure, and I explain all that. But when I finish, I will write a paper and publish a paper for you with lots of footnotes, and it'll be very academic. But that is essentially what I'm putting out to you, is that the ideologues and the bureaucrats will wreck the strategic process, and we have to deal with that and so forth. So I'm going to illustrate. I know that many of you are political scientists and you love models. Well, I have taken my strategic decision system, which is adapted from Dante's Inferno. And in Dante's Inferno, you have right at the bottom, well, that's the devil at the bottom, but the lowest, nastiest part of hell. Now, that's the ninth circle. That is the people that make the decisions. That is the presidents, the prime ministers, the cabinet members, the powerful ones who have the decision-making responsibility for strategy. Now, the next circle is the eighth circle. Actually, it's called the flatterers and sorcerers, but that's a good description. The eighth circle of hell are the deputy cabinet ministers, are the 3- and 4-star generals. They are the legislative leaders. They are the ones that, in every sense, control the access to the inner circle, and they exert the direct influence on the inner circle. Now, then we come to the seventh circle of hell, right up there. Now, I was in the seventh circle of hell. The seventh circle, as a major lieutenant colonel, we're the ones that the eighth circle, who come up with an idea or a plan, they go to the eighth circle and they say, now, Corum, write a strategic plan, or write an operational plan, or develop the doctrine. And most of the people in the eighth circle are basically good people, and we do the best we can, and we do our duty, which is to provide the plans. I'm the one that briefs I don't brief the president or the cabinet. I do brief and have briefed the deputy secretaries, the 4-star and the 3-star generals, and so forth, and actually written and developed the plans as part of a small team. So I could give you that view. Now, the problem is most of the people in the eighth circle are really first-rate people, and I love working with them. The problem is some of the ones in the seventh circle, where I am, they're innately bureaucrats and ideologues. You find some in there, and they will do anything. They will sell their soul. They will say anything so they can move up to the eighth circle, or at least become insiders with the eighth circle. So you have some problems with the seventh circle where I live. But for the most part, you have some really outstanding people in the seventh circle. There's a lot of history to model from. Here's a Pershing 1A missile. When I was a second lieutenant, I started out in the strategic level because a Pershing missile, it was called a short-range missile. It wasn't very short-ranged. This has a 150 kiloton warhead, which is 10 times the Hiroshima bomb. This was a major part of our deterrence in Europe. Forces you as a lieutenant to think strategically, not tactically. So that was my introduction. And by the way, it's interesting that we were an asset. Yes, we were under American command. The Germans also had Pershing missiles. The Luftwaffe had an entire wing of the Pershing 1As. And by the way, we worked together very closely with the German Luftwaffe and their Pershings as being part of our European nuclear deterrent. But under wartime, it comes under the Central Army Group. And the Central Army Group is a multinational staff, included Canadians too, and the British and the Americans and the Germans. It was commanded by a German general. If it ever came to war in Europe, we were going to turn over the nuclear weapons authority to a German general, so it wouldn't be the Americans that ordered the third nuclear strike in the world. It would have been a German. That was clever politics. But it did make you think in the big picture, which is what you need to do as a strategist. Now, we have talked about Russia today, so I can pass on that. And we even mentioned Project Russia. I am very lucky. I am married to a Russia expert who is actually my wife, who has published 2 academic articles, and she has written about Project Russia, which is the 4 volumes of the Russian state ideology. By the way, everyone in the Baltic countries where I worked, this is how I came to know about Project Russia, knew all about it. We actually have the hard copies. They're not difficult to buy. They are not allowed to be translated into any other language. You have to know Russian to read the Russian state ideology. I have asked some of the most senior people in the U.S. State Department and the U.S. military what they thought of Project Russia, which is, by the way, published in the millions. Every time, there's 4 volumes written by a circle of people, of intellectuals around Putin. But it is the state ideology. When they publish a new edition, boxes of them come to every ministry in Russia, and it's highly recommended reading for all Russian officials. So that gives you an idea how important Project Russia is, and I do know some British that are quite familiar with it. Everyone in the Eastern Europeans know this very well. On the other hand, incredible ignorance in the United States about Project Russia. You'd think that, it's like it's August 1939, and nobody's ever heard of Mein Kampf. But this actually does explain a lot about Putin and the Russians and how they think. And this was brought up in the last talks about the Russian view of geopolitics and so forth. It's all in there in Project Russia. It's nice to know what your opponent is. By the way, being an old Cold Warrior, as I am, back in the late 70s when I became an Army officer stationed in Germany, we didn't really think of the Russians. There wasn't any hatred there. We didn't think of the Russians as enemies. I'm thinking of one of my heroes, General Curtis LeMay, the man that created the Strategic Air Command, one of the greatest Cold Warriors of all time. And he was being briefed when he was Air Force Chief of Staff in the 60s. And this intelligence captain referred to the Russians as the enemy. And LeMay says, "Captain, stop. I want to explain this to you. The Russians are not our enemy. The enemy is the U.S. Navy." By the way, that of all the LeMay quotes, that is not apocryphal. That is absolutely in character of how. But that's also the bureaucratic issues in the U.S. military. You have the service infighting that I have witnessed between a school ground fight is more dignified than some of the things, I'm not even joking, that come across when you have services going at each other. And again, that's one of the problems that we have to do when it comes to doing anything at the strategic level. You get the personal issues involved. Now, another experience I had, at least in getting involved in strategy, is when I went to work in January 2009 in the Baltic states. I was given a mission, basically the first day. Every 10 years, NATO goes through a process of the NATO strategic revision, and it's the big NATO conference and meeting, and they will actually, and the preparatory work begins a year in advance as to how NATO should revise its strategy. Now, working for the 3 Baltic states, and what you had in 2009, 2010 was a very real concern of the Eastern Europeans who know the Russians, that the Western Europeans were getting all weak and mushy about Russia and were thinking, well, let's not concentrate, as NATO's center is Article 5, collective self-defense. Let's de-emphasize collective self-defense. And by the way, the Obama administration had just come in, and State Department was also very fuzzy about, well, maybe we should, revise our thinking of Russians and turn NATO into a worldwide feel-good organization where NATO would go out everywhere and intervene and help people and do whatever they thought was a good idea. It was an optimistic moment. Now, this is taking place after Russia's invasion of Georgia, but they're still, maybe we can bring the Russians in to join us in good global things. And obviously, they hadn't read Project Russia and how Russia feels about the Western Europeans. But what was going on within NATO, very clearly for this long process, and I was told to provide whatever help I could, which I was very happy to do, is the Eastern Europeans were grouping together to try to educate the Western Europeans and make sure that at the next 2010 conference that NATO would remain collective defense and it would not become a global do-good organization. So we were involved in lobbying. Actually, I didn't do that. I was working with some brilliant people from the Baltic states. All I did was edit some of the things that they were writing just to make their English sound better, just for style and readability. But their ideas were first rate. But we were also operated as a think tank. We put together studies and conferences, but reports supporting the view that the Russians are a big problem and we need to keep collective defense. And in fact, it was over a year, all the infighting with the Europeans. The Eastern Europeans did get their way and did get to keep Article 5 as the center of things, which I am very grateful to do that. But it was very interesting, at least being a very small part of that process. And yes, there was a lot of mistrust between the Eastern Europeans and the Western Europeans on the nature of the Russians and so forth. And there was a very fuzzy, friendly view of the Russians among many of the Americans and Europeans, that we could be pals with them. In 1990s, Cold War ends, and we went, the Americans and the Europeans, we went way too far in demilitarizing our forces. The U.S. Army was went to about 55% of what it was in 1990. The Air Force is probably about less than half in numbers of aircraft. The U.S. Navy went from 15 carrier air groups and 450 ships. We now have under 311 carrier air groups, which is actually not enough to do all of the commitments that the Americans have around the world. We don't have enough ships. We don't have enough planes. We go to war with 9/11 in Afghanistan, then Iraq. For the first time in American history, the United States went to war without increasing its armed forces and the numbers. They were so convinced by the technological, by the ideologues, that technology ruled everything. We don't need to have large armies and air forces and so forth in mass. It was because our technology, and it will remain this way forever. The other guys won't get the technology we have. They'll stay way behind. Huge number of bad assumptions. So we demilitarized. The Europeans went further than we did, and then you end up with the very miserable, paltry force that the Bundeswehr devolved into from being such a great military. Okay, now we are finally confronted with a crisis, and it takes a crisis to enact any military reforms. In my long life, from the time I was a junior officer, there were really two periods of crisis that forced the United States and the Europeans to react and to do some very fundamental reforms. And the first, at least for the Americans, is the post-Vietnam era. And I come in the Army a few years after Vietnam, where my older brother had served. And there was a great unhappiness in the U.S. Army. There was a great disquiet. We knew we had screwed up. We knew we had failed, and that there was fundamental reforms needed in our doctrine, in our training, in our organization, needed to be revamped, that we couldn't do this again. And there was a lot of debate going on. It was very public within the military. And by the way, there were complaints by the generals that it was unseemly that people were criticizing the Army and the organization. But it was an era of demanding reform. And there was the malaise of Carter, in which inflation went wild, and the military, it looked like the volunteer military was going to fail. We couldn't get enough recruits. The administration changed. Reagan came in with the policy of openly challenging the Russians and basically massive rearmament. I had left. I'd done my first tour in the Army, left the Army, gone to England and Oxford, and I took my incredibly generous from those days educational benefits, and I went to Oxford. And I did a graduate degree in medieval history and became a highly qualified medieval historian. And I went back to the U.S., and I couldn't get a job as a medieval historian. So I went back in the U.S. Army, got promoted to captain. I was the best medieval historian in the United States Army. I'm proud of that. But a couple years, it was like 2 years after Reagan came in, and we had discipline problems, drug problems, training problems, budget problems. The Army was close to being broken. 2 years later, they had enacted enormous reforms. And it was amazing to see a unit like the 82nd. It was a transformed Army. One of the reforms had been raising the standards, making things tougher, making training tougher and more. Of course, they increased the pay and the benefits and made life better. They got rid of, they had a program to get rid of the bad soldiers. The first weeks they had the program, we got rid of about 30,000 U.S. soldiers. Morale shot up. You get rid of the bad troops. And the military, because we had more recruits than we knew what to do with. The military just expanded because Reagan did bring in a big expansion when we had no problem in getting more troops. With a smaller military and lower standards, our recruitment for volunteers was broken. But then we raised standards, improved conditions, and we go to a 15.5 division Army. We have barely 10 divisions today. But But we changed a lot of things, and there was that push on. And of course, because the Russians had become aggressive and put new nuclear weapons in Europe, the Americans turn around and we put more divisions in Europe, we put more tanks, we put new nuclear weapons, cruise missiles, the Pershing becomes the Pershing II, and a whole array of new weapons. And then, which I think was a brilliant idea, because after we're rearmed, at that point, Reagan sits down and he says, okay, Russians, let's talk. Because the one thing that your Russians and your Chinese respect is pure, brute military power. This soft power thing, I'm so glad that was mentioned, doesn't really convince Russians or Chinese. But when you have lots of hard power, that's when you sit down and say, no, let's talk about arms reduction. And it worked. It was a great strategy. I'm very proud of having been there and seen all of that. But we had a much bigger defense industrial base. The Cold War ends, and we deindustrialized, and of course you are deindustrializing, and that was a bad thing to do. Now, one thing that I learned growing up and serving in Europe and with Europeans is the Europeans make a lot of really great military equipment, and we admired that. And we make a lot of really great military equipment. And if only we could get together and do better at sharing equipment and technologies and so on, things would be good. Anyway, competition is good, but the people that keep us from doing sensible things is the bureaucracy, usually. And I can give you some great examples of how the bureaucracy blocks simple, effective, practical solutions. And like I said, it takes a crisis to get any change that we have. Now, our crisis, and they're finally doing something about it, is that the new Secretary of Defense, who probably gets a lot of bad press, but we have a defense acquisition procurement system that is literally broken. And Hegseth at least, is working all out to change the system, the entire acquisition system. What happened when we deindustrialized is that we allowed a lot of the aviation and high-tech companies to merge. We have fewer aircraft firms than we did in the 1980s. And the mergers were good, Wall Street liked that, but there's a lot less competition. And in fact, there are now too many cases of supplying missiles and equipment and aircraft, and there's only one company that makes those missiles or can make that aircraft model. And when you're when you're dependent on one company for key equipment, they're going to overcharge you. The waste and mismanagement that I have seen because of things like this is awful. We have very long, years-long development schedules. I remember getting briefed on the F-35 in the mid-1990s, and in a couple years, we're going to have the F-35. And then 20 years later, we finally have this very slow breakout in production. The F-35 and the increase in costs is so incredible. That has become the most expensive weapons program in the world. And it's because, again, we simply had too few suppliers, too little competition on the F-35. The only aircraft, actually in the entire Cold War period, and in recent years, there was only one aircraft that was built on time and on budget, and that was the A-10 Warthog. And it was so good the first time it came out, they never made additional models of that. It's still flying. By the way, the Air Force hates it because it's dedicated to close air support. It's not a strategic bomber. And they have wanted to get rid of it ever since the beginning. But they used existing production lines. They used the F-105 landing gear that was already in production. They had plenty of them, and they cobbled together different things. They built it around this magnificent 30-millimeter cannon that shreds armor. Is on time, on production. Basically, no other aircraft since then has been on time, on production schedule, and on budget. And it's all really due to politics and the bureaucracy. And the Pentagon bureaucracy is totally bloated. In 1945, the Pentagon had the United States had 12 million people under arms. And everything was done by paper and telex in those days. And so we had literally armies of secretaries typing papers and reports and paperwork. We had 33,000 people working in the Pentagon in 1945 to manage an armed forces of 12 million. We have an armed forces counting every single reservist of 2.14 million today, and we have 28,000 bureaucrats in the Pentagon. Yes, that will tell you something. What they're doing right now is tearing up the contract system from the cost-plus contracts, which lead to giant inefficiencies and cost overruns, and it provides every company an incentive to pad the payroll, to pad the expenses. It actually causes billions of dollars worth of waste and fraud. They're going more to a tougher fixed price contract system. Of course, we need Congress to pass all these laws to do that, but I'm saying right now they're working all out at high speed to change the fundamental system. They've actually canceled billions of dollars worth of bad contracts, and I'm very, very happy they have. Now, the real problem is this lack of competition, and I'm thinking that some of the American lessons might be applicable to the European defense industry, which I think is very much in the same situation, that you have too few firms and you're too dependent on your weapon systems from one company, and of course that's a license to steal. What they're trying to do is create, and there have been complaints, there are many middle-sized firms that are capable of producing certain technologies and models that are not allowed into the contracting process. We have made it so difficult for a mid-sized company to get considered to produce defense materials, weapons, and parts. And that is a top priority, is to make it easier for mid-sized companies so we can get some more competition. So they're also looking at making it easier access to credit and support. In other words, a much simpler system with a lot more competition, with many more companies. You know, people forget World War II, one of the war-winning weapons is the Jeep. The company that won the bid and the contract was this minuscule automotive company called Willis. And they made tractors, mostly, small trucks. They were the one that invented the Jeep, and one of the most effective weapons, military equipment of all time. And of course, the Army basically told the other automotive companies that they had to produce this Jeep, and they would get, of course, the Willys, this little company, gets the licensing fees. So they made money, they expanded, and everybody else made a profit. But, we need to actually think of how we can get these small companies. And by the way, we do have all kinds of defense laws that can force companies to cooperate. They don't like to use them because it's a political issue. But there are actually vast powers in the Defense Department that the President can employ to force companies to produce certain weapons and so forth. One of the problems we have, and I highlighted this in my book on fighting the war against terror, is that when we drew down the forces in the Cold War, the ideologues proposed that we can get rid of military capacity and rely on civilian corporations, because civilian corporations do things cheaper and more efficiently than the military. Well, I've largely written a book about how stupid this idea was. Because now, of course, throughout history, we use civilian contractors. The merchant marine is a good example. We ship things overseas. We hire civilians. We ship them overseas. We hire rail cars. We move things across the country. Actually done that operationally. But when they went too far, to the point that they were having civilian companies doing things. We go into Iraq. We don't increase the military for the Iraq War, which is interesting. By the way, in June 25th, 1876, General Custer had most of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, a few hundred men, was killed by the Sioux and the Cheyenne Indians. A week later, when the word got to Washington of this military defeat, disaster of General Custer, Congress immediately voted an increase in the U.S. Army cavalry of 1,000 men, and that was to fight the Sioux and the Cheyenne Indians. So here we are going to war in Iraq, and we don't increase the size of the U.S. Army because we can rely on contractors. Now, one of the things they relied on is contractors to provide military linguists and interrogators. And if you've heard of the Abu Ghraib disaster, where people got abused, Iraqis, and these weren't terrorists, these were common criminals. And I was there at the time. Everybody knew there was something wrong going on with that unit. It was very clear. People were talking about that. But for political reasons, I didn't find out about it until I got back from Iraq. They had a lot of the problems. They had untrained civilians hired by the military who were abusing prisoners. It was an amazing scandal. We had a lot of scandals in Iraq by civilian contractors who were, in normal times, would do military things. Now, I'll tell you something about working with civilians in a war zone. I was in Iraq in 2003 as a strategic planner. And one of the problems with contractors is if you ask them to do something, let's say it's not in their contract, well, you have to then go from the manager to call up corporate headquarters, and they will sit down with you and they will talk about giving you some extra fees, and you actually have to negotiate, and this is in the middle of combat zone, you have to negotiate the revised deal. Now, they had one circumstance in Afghanistan and using contractors to repair equipment. And, of course, the contract said that they didn't have to work on weekends because everyone knows wars stop on weekends. And they didn't have to work on weekends unless you declared an emergency. So every week, the unit commander, depending on these, declared an emergency and forced them to be there on weekends to repair equipment. But this is what you have to do. In the middle of a war, you have to sit down with the corporation lawyer of a civilian contractor to, well, if you want us to do this, you got to pay us more money. It's absolutely amazing. And that was all to keep, they were thinking long term, because if you have, let's say, I spent many years as a reservist. And being a reservist means that when they give you an order, it says, Corum, report to Camp Meade, here's your orders, you're going on duty. You're legally obligated to report to Camp Meade and fit healthy, ready to go, and be shipped to wherever you go. And then if they want you to work you 24 hours a day, if they want to send you into combat, you go, yes, sir, and that's an order. You obey it. Otherwise, there are things they could do to you for not obeying orders. Once they've got you in uniform, they control what you do. They can order you, go here or there. If you're a civilian, they can't order you to go here or there without the contract being approved. They can't order you to work on weekends unless that's been worked into the contract and all those things. I have no idea why they ever, but they did that because, you see, being even a reserve called to active duty, I do enough years in the reserves and I get a military retirement, which is very generous, free medical care the rest of my life, and all kinds of nice benefits. And Lynn, you enjoy the nice benefits, right? You know, the retired pay, free medical. But no, seriously, the reason they didn't want to have in-house, see, in the old Cold War, we had a huge logistics structure. We had medical support units. We had every kind of specialist units. Now, I belonged actually to a logistics unit, ordnance unit that basically dealt with ammunition, huge quantities of ammunition. I had to go to school, military school. I can run an ammunition dump. I also know all about explosives. Military education is great. Anyway, they want to, in that case, if there had been the big war in Europe or any conflict, like in the first Gulf War, they call up ammunition units like mine. Now, as a reservist, we wouldn't have been very useful as an infantry fighting force or kicking in the doors in Fallujah. We actually only did one thing, and that was to transport, control, and supply ammunition. But when you train every month and every year you go on exercises, and the only thing you do is that one function, we were actually better at that than the regular Army units, because there's a lot less transition. We have people that had been in the ammunition business in that unit for 10 years, 20 years. I mean, we had these old sergeants, and that's all they could do. But that's fine, because that's what logistics unit. If you have an intelligence unit or a linguist unit, and you get together and you practice doing your one job, those people are very good. In a sense, that's your strategic reserve. And they went into, and reserves are basically cheap. But we got rid of a huge part of our infrastructure, which was quite enormous, and decided to use civilian corporations. But just read the book. You can see all of the abuses, the disasters, and the failures of that kind of mentality. But that's the kind of thing that we need to get rid of. Actually, we should have a much bigger army and a much bigger reserves. And what I would tell my Baltic friends is, think of the Swiss system, conscript lots of people, lots of training, and have a very big reserve, and equip them with, basic, simple weapons, and like the Carl Gustav. We're looking back to acquire things like the Carl Gustav, instead of your javelins and your very expensive wire-guided weapons. 84 millimeter Carl Gustav is a precision weapon. These are pretty good, and it's a fraction of the price. And if you want to defend your country, lots and lots of fairly well-trained reserves with things like Carl Gustavs and anti-tank weapons and mines. I know the Europeans don't like mines, but the Finns never signed the anti-mine treaty. There's a reason for it. I love the Finnish military. Finland, if you take a look at Finland, the entire country, civilians too, is organized for mobilization. And here's a country, I admire the Israelis too, because they've been surrounded. Their existence depends on an effective military system. And in the case of the Finns, they fought 3 wars against Russia, 5.5 million Finns, and they've survived. And I admire them for that. And they survived because they have one hell of a mobilization system that puts everyone to work. And I think it's a superb model. The Baltics want to defend themselves, and the Poles, the Russians would think twice about, okay, they might win, but they're going to take some very heavy losses if you have an entire population full of reserves. Too many people followed the American model of having a small volunteer force. It's important to have a volunteer cadre. I actually believe in larger armies. And again, mass is a good thing, and it doesn't cost a fortune to have mass. Anyway, we are working right now in Washington about getting more competition. That's an absolute top priority. Also using military assets. The U.S. Navy has 15 shipyards, and that's for repair and overhaul. Until 1965, the U.S. Navy built its own ships. Brooklyn Navy Yard built its last ship, and they stopped doing that because Secretary of Defense McNamara, the same guy that screwed up the Vietnam War, he said, civilians could do it cheaper and better. Right now we don't have our shipbuilding capacity is in a crisis. I'll point out, now the U.S. actually has a policy. We actually have a written strategy, did an assessment in 2016 that we need a 356 ship Navy because the U.S. operates all over the world. The U.S. Navy is now 294 ships, and here's where I say the Biden administration got it wrong. They may have talked a lot, but it's dropping to 291. We want ships, they're too expensive, and we do not have the shipyard capacity that we need. In fact, I'd say it's an emergency that we need to have more ships. Now, one thing that was very recently done, which makes me very happy, is the Trump administration signed a deal with Finland to provide icebreaker Coast Guard cutters for the Arctic, because basically nobody builds better ice-breaking ships than the Finns do, and they know their stuff. And I am very happy to see us actually buying equipment from the Europeans. Now, here's another deal I rather like. The Fincantieri frigate. Fincantieri is a big Italian shipbuilder, and they make the best frigates going. They're superior to the U.S. designs, so we are filling our frigate needs, and we just gave them a contract to build frigates. And I am very happy to see us buying European equipment as a niche thing. Personally think that when we buy their frigates, we cut an arrangement, you buy our helicopters. Now, we make great helicopters. I mean, I believe that we can work out these deals with the Europeans, but it is an emergency now. The U.S. is a treaty ally with South Korea and Japan. Now, a treaty has to be approved by 2/3 of the U.S. Senate, and that becomes permanent U.S. law unless that treaty is revoked. Now, things like the Kyoto Treaty and the Paris Accord, those weren't passed by the Senate. That's a presidential, they call it a treaty, it's not. It's a presidential deal. Next president could just take it, rip it up, which Trump did for the Kyoto things. He can't rip up the U.S.-Japan. The U.S. is actually committed to defending Japan. We are committed to defending South Korea. And they are our treaty allies, and we can actually trust them with military secrets because we operate together. And I think we need to, if we want to get more ships, we ought to really be looking at the South Koreans in particular and building the hulls, and we can finish it off and emplace the weapons. But we need a lot more advantage, and people right now they are talking about getting the South Korean, working to shipbuild with the South Koreans. So I'm very happy because Navy shipbuilding has been in a mess for a long time. Airbus came up. All your Air Force, U.S. Air Force can't operate without tankers. You don't go to war. If you don't have tankers, you can't fly your airplanes. And Airbus, which of course is European, they came up with a really good design, and all the good tankers are basically big, heavy cargo passenger planes, and they pump gas and they're modified. And there was, in the last couple of years, there's huge infighting in Congress because they're up against Boeing and the few American aviation companies, aircraft companies. Frankly, I think the Airbus is a better product. But this is one of the political issues that you get into in politicians and congressmen screaming that you're giving their money to the Europeans. Well, where are they building really great Airbuses right now? Right in my neighborhood, Mobile, Alabama. And in the little southern town I live in Foley, the biggest employer in this little southern town is Collins Aerospace, and they make reverse jet thrusters for the Airbus. So they're a great company. But anyway, more defense cooperation. Here's another way we can do it. Yes, I'm in favor of buying Airbuses because they're better tankers. I know Germany's deindustrializing, but if there are any Germans here, well, if you're going to deindustrialize, don't send it to China, send it to Lithuania. And so next year we're going to have a 155 millimeter ammunition plant in Lithuania. Some might say, and you're right, this is not enough. We need to go a lot further and a lot faster, but at least I feel good that there are some major steps being taken, and partly because we recognize the Russia problem. Now, Russia's not going to change, and I have a Baltic view of the Russians, but I do believe in having a modified containment policy that we can all agree on. 5% of defense ought to be the goal. Now, the other one issue to talk about is China, and they are a major power. They are imperialist. They are aggressive. They're the second largest economy in the world. We handed them the technology. Take the rare earths. The United States was the world leader in rare earths processing. A corporation in Indiana produced all the magnets we needed for our aircraft and our spacecraft and our special weaponry. And in the 1990s, a Washington insider, one of the powerful guys, Archibald Cox Jr., he fronted for a bunch of shell companies owned by big shots in China in cahoots with the government. And they sold American rare earths processing and the factory that they did it to this company controlled by the Chinese. But they said, that's fine, we'll keep the company open. Well, a short time later, they closed all the American factories in production and shipped all of the equipment and machinery to China. That is what started the Chinese rare earths program. We sold it to them. The U.S. Defense Department said, don't do this. This is a bad thing. And the State Department, I feel like Curtis LeMay. The enemy is the State Department. Chinese are adversaries. But the State Department said, oh, what a great idea. We can get along with the Chinese. And if we do trade with them, they'll become more capitalist. But we did this. Anyway, the disaster of deindustrializing for China and in our refining, mining, and our assets is pretty incredible. And now one of the issues is I have a cousin of mine I grew up with in California, spent a lot of time together, and he went to engineering school and became, he got his mechanical engineering. He loved computers and stuff. He worked, he's getting started, late 70s. He meets a guy called Steve Jobs, and he gets hired by Steve Jobs. And he moves up in the company run by Steve Jobs. And then he meets another guy who's also getting involved in this computer stuff called Bill Gates. And then he goes to work for Bill Gates, and he moves up in Bill Gates' company. That, Kazuma pretty much a computer whiz and so forth. And he became the director of marketing for Microsoft. I'm saying not a director of marketing, the director of marketing. I think he was making about $10 million a year more than I was, give or take a few $100,000. And he, I think it was about 18 years ago, he's still in his 40s, and he left working for Bill Gates. He's now inventing tools and processes for people that do woodworking. He's very sharp. That's his hobby. When you made that kind of money, you can do your hobby. He's actually set up a little factory to make these actually very relatively inexpensive woodworking tools used by hobbyists and so on. But he gave a talk to the Microsoft board right before he left, and he said there is not a trade deficit with China, it's a theft deficit. I was in classified briefings in the late 1990s. I can't give you the details, but China surpassed every other country, Iran, Russia. These are small-timers. China is surpassed in stealing ideas, stealing intellectual property, and espionage, and it hasn't gotten smaller. It's bigger. China got where it was by stealing stuff, and we let them do it. Europeans let them do it. We let them do it. Now, what I'm saying, it's very nice. We are actually in a crash program to decouple on the rare earths processing. There's one right now, but they're opening quite a few. Within the next year or so, they're opening new plants, South Carolina, Utah, as it turns out, Texas. As it turns out, there are a lot of the rare minerals and earths that are necessary that are in the U.S. The U.S. is actually quite rich in rare earths and minerals. There's one mine in Alaska that produces a lot. There are cases of lithium, for example, is being found in Pennsylvania in large quantities. But if you go around the U.S., graphite, large graphite deposits, we are 100% reliant on China for graphite, but we have plenty of graphite. We just have to extract it and work that. And that is actually a top priority for the Defense Department. We can hope the Europeans better jump in on this too, so we can decouple our rare earths, and because China actually can control our defense, as we've talked about before. All those special magnets make those super weapons work. Like I said, in my lifetime, when you face ideologues and bureaucrats, they will stop that. I am a bit optimistic because from what I hear today is that there is a consensus, at least among smart people here, hopefully a consensus is that we really are in a mess and there's a crisis, because that's the only way we get defense reforms, and we can push the bureaucrats to the side and the ideologues and do things like rare earths, military organizational reform. And we've got a lot of good models to do that. Like I said, they're on the seventh circle of hell. There are lots of really great people, a lot of really great Europeans. And by the way, when I did some of that strategic planning in Iraq, it was multinational with the Europeans. And I love working with the British and the Australians and the French. But anyway, whatever academics might think, yes, the Trump administration can be a bit raucous, and they are not very politic and friendly. But when it comes down, remember, we have an ancient saying in America: don't take what Trump says literally, but do take it seriously. Okay, when he talks about pulling out of NATO, that's the Trump hyperbole. But what it really means is, Europeans, come on, let's cut to a deal. I don't think there's. I actually think that there are some very pro-European viewpoints. They just don't know how to express them. I grew up around Europeans, so I can say it more. They should have hired me to say it more diplomatically and nicely. Because the only way that NATO works is if the Americans take the lead and get the Europeans to do things. And that's what has made work. But from all the downside we're talking today, I am happy that the second time in my life there seems to be a consensus is that things have gotten so bad that we have to work together to fix them. And I think that on the issues like the defense technology and the rare earths, and to some extent the rearmament, is that we can work together. And I thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Corum. It was really, really interesting. So before I open the floor for questions, I do have one question myself. So on the one hand, in the European Union right now, we have this project, or this plan that I said before earlier, the Readiness 2030, that is planning on promote public procurement, but collaborative public procurement, but also diversify the industrial base by promoting mid-caps and mid-sized enterprises in defense. But at the same time, the EU is a bureaucratic monster. So I wanted to ask you if you believe that this kind of strategy, will it be enough to actually push the industrial base in Europe on defense, or will the bureaucracy that we have ongoing be the cause of the wreck and the incapability to actually arrive to a better situation for the industry? Right?
Well, it's the organization that has the problem. And in historical examples, in 1941, General Marshall ordered a junior major, Albert Wedemeyer, and a team of 6 officers to plan for the United States if the United States got into a war with Germany and Japan, which was quite likely. By the way, the U.S. Army War College since 1934 had predicated all its war games and instructions on a future in which the United States, allied with England or other allies, would be fighting Germany and Japan, coalition warfare. In 4 months, and supported by the War Department, supervised by a couple smart colonels, he came up with the war plan for the U.S. Army for World War II, essentially production of 200 divisions worth of equipment. We ended up having 96 divisions, but we armed 100 divisions, British Commonwealth, French, Russian, so forth. It was a brilliant war plan. The only way you can get things done is by a small team of hand-picked people, and if you turn it over to the bureaucracy, I was writing the U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine for the Army and Marines. We had a team of 10 people. It was a very innovative doctrine. The best part was we had a social anthropologist who wrote a model, sort of a social network analysis. If you're doing counterinsurgency, you want to understand the sociology of the area, region you're operating in, and understanding who's the elites and how the different groups work. Because in a place like Iraq, it's not like Vietnam where you're up against North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. You're operating with up to 20 different factions, some of them friendly, some of them hostile, all of whom have agendas, and they're connected to elites. And this anthropologist wrote us sort of a basic primer for essentially junior officers to use to do in an analysis. And the work of writing a new U.S. doctrine was done by a small team in 4 months. But then they send it out, and this was Petraeus' mistake, because I worked for him, to the whole Army. And so the Pentagon and everyone, and there is this Major General at the Intelligence Center at Fort Huachuca that said, no, you have to throw out the entire doctrine because the Intelligence Corps does not recognize the term social network analysis. So we won't allow the doctrine to be published. This is the pure bureaucrat holding on to the Intelligence Center's power over doctrine. It had to go to the Chief of Staff for frankly, that Major General should have been fired. But no, the only way to do that is to have it be pushed through and have a small team to do that. In every case, the plan to produce hundreds of thousands of airplanes in World War II was done by about 13 officers, mostly majors and lieutenant colonels. It was done by a small team in a matter of weeks. And those were the plans that won World War II. And I found in dealing with, for 8 months, because I wrote 2 big parts of the Army Marine Corps doctrine, and I'm getting fired at by these people in the Pentagon. They wanted, well, first of all, it actually started a major battle because I wrote an air power doctrine for the Army and Marines. And the U.S. Air Force, and I have this from, there was a book written about the process that we did by the team chief, Conrad Crane. And there were Air Force 4-stars having temper tantrums and screaming because an Army guy had written about air power. Now, I define air power as like drones, and how about helicopters? Is that air power? How about Marine Corps F-18s? Yes, I mean, we're talking, actually the Army and Marines have a lot more things that fly in the air than the Air Force does. But the Air Force actually, again, went full bureaucracy. And by the way, when they eventually wrote their doctrine, which was about strategic bombing, they actually included the doctrine I wrote verbatim. But it had to be written by Air Force officers. No, again, it finally went to the service chiefs. Army and Marines can have their own air doctrine. God bless the Marine Corps. They love their aviation. They don't believe in going to war without aviation. Army doesn't either. And the Marine Corps just says, no. Well, again, they had a screaming match. And no, when I'm talking about school kid battles, I'm not exaggerating. And that was the pure bureaucracy of the Air Force, is that only we get to write. Of course, they hadn't written a doctrine since Vietnam. We were trying to write a modern doctrine. Anyway, I could say that one of our big problems is we don't hold people accountable. After 9/11, absolute disaster. And I wrote about this, and Tinent, the CIA chief, who'd been kept on from the Clinton administration, the Bush people loved him, he doesn't get fired. He had one talent, and it was not in intelligence or counterterrorism. He had one talent, and that was making himself amenable to whoever, anybody, Republican, Democrat in Washington. He was the invention. Nobody got fired for 9/11. And then we have, in 2021, the debacle in Afghanistan, and not a single person got fired. I just wrote a book earlier this year about France 1940 and the campaign. After France and Norway, Winston Churchill, my fifth cousin, by the way, fired the head of the British Army, chief of the Imperial General Staff, the head of the British fleet, gets fired. He becomes port commander of Portsmouth, and the chief of the RAF. He decapitated the top leadership of the British military because they were bad leaders. And they found a lot of very, very good leaders and promoted them up. When Marshall took over the U.S. Army, accountability is an issue, and that has been a huge problem with the Americans. I don't think the Europeans hold people accountable for failure either. Anyway, I'm just saying, yes, the only way to break through to this and get things done properly is you need small hand-picked teams. And if you allow the bureaucracy to get involved, forget it. It won't happen. If you want to do acquisitions, get a hand-picked team, people know acquisitions, some great defense economists. Don't get the top-ranking people. Get majors and lieutenant colonels who are smart and have them do it, and then have some forceful people push this through. Anyway, I know how to get it done, though. That is the way to do it. And it works. Believe me. Any questions? Come on, fire away.
Thanks very much, James. That was really interesting. I have one quick comment and then a question. The comment is, look, with all respect, the U.S. economy of the 19th century was built upon IP theft, especially from Britain. There was no patent protection for foreigners in the USA up until, I believe, 1860s. There was open theft of technology, state-sponsored, as well as open poaching of skilled workers, again, sponsored by the state. The situation so pissed off everyone, including Charles Dickens, that he was at wit's end about the fact that Americans would literally just steal his stuff and print it and make millions. So anyway, the point is here that as a European, or at any rate a Briton of Canadian extraction, I'm a bit ambivalent about America because, with all respect, our interests don't always align. You mentioned Afghanistan. Britain was not told that amongst the other many aspects that made that a debacle, Britain wasn't told that that the United States was leaving. This is without mentioning, moreover, the unmentionable Nord Stream 2's inexplicable implosion. My question, though, is about the eighth circle of hell and its denizens, if I understand the people there. There is a pipeline of senior officers from military service directly into defense industry at high level and into lobbying. Isn't that just plain corruption? Absolutely.
And we have a lot, and partly because we're relying on civilian contractors to do things like testing and training for the armed forces. In this last month, we had a 4-star admiral convicted. He was bragging. He gave a whopping big contract, a training contract, and frankly, I don't think civilian companies should do training. We should do that all in-house. He gave us a training contract, a sole source supplier, so they didn't, no bid contract. And then he goes and he publicly brags on the company website that he's retiring. It was a 4-star admiral, and he's going to work for the company he just gave the contract to and making $500,000 a year. And luckily, there was probably one of his captains who hated his guts, rightly so, who turned him in, and they convicted him. But they didn't send him to a military courts-martial. They sent him to the Washington, D.C. court, and they took 2 stars away. So when he gets out of prison, he will get retirement as a 2-star. Yes, the whole approach of doing civilian contracting, and there's nothing new, by the way. You've heard of the B-29 bomber. Well, the guy that made by the way, the B-29 was the most expensive weapons program of World War II. Far exceeded the atomic bomb in cost, and it wasn't working. And Bennett Myers was a 2-star general, chief of the Army Air Forces Materiel Command, when the Army Air Forces was actually larger than the entire U.S. Armed Forces today. And he gave out billions in contract. Do you know how much a billion was in 1943-44? Yeah, we're talking huge sums. He was a management engineering genius. He got the B-29 to work, and it was a dud aircraft until he got it in production and fixed, and then it wins the war. He is a genuine guy who ended World War II. At the same time, being a management financial genius, he set up dummy shell corporations, subcontracted to himself. He wasn't like this idiot admiral that just got sacked and convicted. They actually had to track him down. It almost got away with it. And my father, in the brief time he was demobilized, he was an accountant actually by profession. He was one of the investigators that put the first West Point two-star general in prison for war profiteering. But if you look for the name Bennett Myers, it's like Orwell. His name has disappeared. It's nothing new about defense contracting. I'm only saying, of course, there was a lot in World War II, but today there are so many scandals in the U.S., and it's because of our contract acquisition system. And I don't know, maybe the Europeans have an honest system, but I sort of doubt it. But this is why we need a revolution in the Pentagon. I think they're being too soft on the generals, and there is a lot of corruption in the whole system. We have this bureaucratic bloat that's killing us, and that has to be dealt with. And yes, I think Hegseth is taking an axe to this stuff, and I'm all for it. I want it to be nastier and harder, and I want to see people go to jail. I want to see some of the people that I worked for punished for incompetence. I can name names and tell you exactly how incompetent. I saw a lot of, like I said, as a strategic planner and doctrine writer, I saw people that should have. We fired a lot of generals in World War II. The British did, the Americans did. When you get to that point, generals, if you're not up to snuff, you've got to go. Anyway, yeah, you're right. We were sleazy back in our early days of industrialization. What can I say?
Thank you for your presentation. Your anecdotes have been very, very interesting. I would like to ask you about, you have said that there are many bureaucrats and ideologues both in Europe and in the US, and they have taken decisions which I would categorize as stabbing ourselves maniacally and shooting ourselves in the foot multiple times. Do we see this pattern in autocracies like Russia and China? Are they stabbing themselves in a maniac way? Are they shooting themselves on the foot like many, many times? I'm not asking this randomly, because if they are not, and if they are better at decision making and at doing things right, this might fuel anti-democratic and democratic skepticism in Europe, and in my opinion, this should really frighten us.
Well, actually, I have friends who have taught in China and spent a year there. And, China is no longer a country of illiterate peasants ruled by the Communist Party. China has a middle class that's educated. And he told me of his students, one of whom had a telephone cover with the Taiwan flag on it. And some of the students were quite open in their contempt for the corruption in China, which is absolutely pervasive. And of course, the military owns companies, and if we have corruption problem, the Chinese corruption problem is endemic, and of course, Russia, the corruption problem is endemic. So it's normal for all the militaries. It's probably worse in Russia and China than it is here, and that's saying a lot. Adam Smith talks about how capitalism works and free trade, and several times in The Wealth of Nations, I carry that on my Kindle. I keep coming back to that because it's such a brilliant book. And he says, this capitalism, free trade, it works. By the way, every time you see a bunch of businessmen get together, they're trying to rig the system, and so on. So I am a Adam Smith capitalist. And as an Adam Smith capitalist, I'm very aware that there are all these people like General Myers, who my father helped put in jail, General Myers out there that are trying to rig the system. He wasn't like the admiral. He was so clever. My father said he and the other team, they were tracking down the money, and he stole millions. Do you know what $1 million was worth in 1945? That's a lot of money. I mean, huge amounts. He said, Jim, we didn't get it all. So when he got out of prison, there was still stuff for the guy. I've seen some contract stuff. In Afghanistan, we actually had one great staff person. It was called SIGAR, S-I-G-A-R, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And then every month, when I was teaching in England, teaching courses about counterterrorism and so forth, I had my students read this. We actually did shoot ourselves in the foot because Afghanistan, there was so corruption, but the organization wasn't there. If you talk about how we organized in the provincial reconstruction teams, and we had these multinational teams, and I know lots of them. I actually did some studies of the people. Lithuanians ran one. I interviewed them. And there were great people. There were great European officers, American officers. There was nobody on the headquarters in Afghanistan that was responsible for their oversight, giving them doctrine, giving them advice. There were essentially, teams were set up, dumped out in Afghanistan to do whatever they did. Money is flowing in gigantic rivers. It was a total mess because nobody set up an organization to look after that part of the process. See, every time you have to look at your organization, you have to cut stuff out, you have to add stuff. Nobody gave any serious thought to organizing these things. It was a horribly organized thing, and the Europeans were part of the screw up, and we were a big part of the screw up. And a lot of the money, EU money, was just burned. It would have been better if they just piled it up and people could warm their hands. Because what happened is you throw too much money in a society like Afghanistan, and you're creating corruption. You actually build a system based on corruption. The mistakes we made are appalling. But what made me angry, actually, in Afghanistan is after that disaster, is that I saw what happened in the U.S. Army. There was, after Vietnam, when I just come in, there's this feeling we need to change, we need to reform. I mean, it was a healthy feeling, and to be part of that. Training a doctrine command was exciting because we were coming up with new doctrine, and they wanted people involved. It was good doctrine. In Afghanistan, there's crickets, nothing. We have this disaster, people dead, nobody fired. It was awful. The Secretary of Defense under Biden had been General Austin. He'd been commander of CENTCOM, Central Command. In other words, responsible for Afghanistan as a general. And I know one person that briefed him. Yeah, you see, all of us that operated in the seventh circle of hell, we talked to each other. And he was a colonel, he's going to give a briefing to the commander of Central Command. It was in the 8th Circle. And his dog robber, well, that's military slang. A dog robber is the senior aide to a general. He has to be somebody unscrupulous enough to rob a dog to be successful aide to a general. Anyway, his aide comes to him before the briefing and says, whatever you do not ask General Austin to make a decision. That's not done here. You'll get in big trouble if you do. And the colonel says, well, this is a decision briefing. It's when you give options to the commanding general to make a choice. And says, no, you can't ask Austin. He was incapable of making a decision. Now, what is the job of a 4-star general? Making decisions. That's why we pay them gigantic amounts of money. I've served under some very good generals and some good colonels. And I've served under people who were utterly, who reached higher command because they had lots of friends at the Air Force Academy, classmates. And I worked for Petraeus, writing the doctrine for the Army and Marines. That was his project, if you heard of Petraeus, who later becomes head of the CIA. And Petraeus He gets involved with a female journalist, and he has an affair to her, and on her laptop, which is not secure, he had TSSCI, that's top secret secure compartmented information, which is not supposed to be on a civilian computer. And he's having his affair with her. He passes her a journalist, top secret information, and they caught him, and he's given a fine and no jail time and probation, because he was very much on the inside in Washington. If I had done exactly what he did, I would be on a video conference wearing an orange jumpsuit from Fort Leavenworth prison, military prison. That is the difference. And by the way, I'm very ecumenical. I've been planning. I've been involved since the Clinton and the Bush and the Obama administrations. Saw them all, Republicans and Democrats, and again, we were not well served after the end of the Cold War by our political leaders and our military.
Go finishing. Sorry to cut you. We should go finishing now. We will have now a 30-minute break, and we can bring up the questions there. We can continue talking to Dr. Corum, and we can be back here around 5 o'clock to have the final remarks of the event. So thank you.